morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the Tapping Your Emotions to Enhance Your Legal Practice Health Law Week event. I'm here with Jen McDowell, who is a licensed attorney turned culture champion. After nearly 20 years in corporate America, she has decided to pursue her passion for helping companies unleash the power of human connection so teams can grow and overcome challenges. Jen draws on her expertise from years of problem solving, analysis, and negotiation as an attorney, her heart-forward leadership style, and her intellectual curiosity about human emotions to help others understand the value of talking about emotions in the workplace. Through her consulting work, she teaches leaders and teams the knowledge and skills to build trust, meaningfully reconnect, and create a safe space to align on organizational change. The end result is a team with renewed spirit and culture that fosters employee engagement, productivity, innovation, and growth. Jen, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me on a Saturday morning, and a special thank you for those on the West Coast. I know it's really early for you there. I am really excited to be here today with you to talk about tapping your emotions to enhance your legal practice. And before we get started, I wanted to just do a little bit more of a background and an introduction for those of you who might not know me. So you have a little context for why I have this crazy idea about talking about your feelings at work. So for those of you who don't know me, I spent the majority of my legal career, excuse me, working in-house as a healthcare regulatory lawyer. Through those experiences, I encountered my fair share of change, whether it was corporate change as a result of mergers, department reorganizations, and even kindly government directed change like the ACA. Through those experiences, I learned a lot about change and how dire the consequences can be when change is deflected or handled poorly. And my experience navigating a large merger, both individually and as a people leader, eventually became the catalyst, although I didn't know it at the time, for this shift in my career. So when I was going through that merger, I really struggled with not having a forum where I could voice my thoughts and my concerns. And I knew how important that was for my team because I saw them struggling with the change as well. So when I had the opportunity to kind of take a step back and really evaluate what my next move was going to be, I realized that this was my chance to help a lot more people navigate change by teaching leaders and teams how to create that safe space that I didn't have. So I'm really excited to be here to share my vision with you. To get us started, I have a couple of poll questions, which we'll get to in just a minute. But for the rest of the time, we'll spend a little bit of time on background. Why feelings? Why now? Why is this the time to be thinking about how we talk differently and interact differently with the people that we interact with at work? I'll also spend some time talking about what I call the 4 primary emotions. Then we'll get into the heart of the presentation where we really start to apply this to our legal practice. We'll wrap up with some short takeaways, and I'll just briefly talk about some of the resources that I have for you. The resources or some of the handouts are posted on the AHLA website, and during the presentation today, we'll have just one brief reflection exercise. So if you haven't pulled down those handouts now, this might be a good time to do it. And I know, Stefan, you'll be able to drop a link into the chat either now or when we get to that point in the presentation, and I can ask for that then. We'll wrap up with some questions. And with that, I guess we will go ahead and get started. I have blocked a little bit of time at the end for questions, but if you have a burning question during the presentation, go ahead and try and raise your hand with the prompts in Zoom. I'll try and pay attention to the window, although I can't see everybody in the view that I have set up. So, Stefan, if I'm missing someone, feel free to interrupt me. So I think that's it. So we'll go ahead and get started. So as I was kind of putting together the presentation, one other thing. For those of you who might be licensed in Missouri, this program has been approved by the Missouri Bar for 1 CLE credit, including 1 ethics credit. I know that a similar program has also been approved in Illinois, although the sponsor was different. So for those of you who might be licensed in Illinois, there might be a way to get credit for it in Illinois as well. So as I was putting together the presentation, I was thinking about what kind of story I would tell. And for me, it started with this, question that I get a lot from people about, this is kind of an out there idea. Why do you think this is the right time to do it? And as I was, making notes, I kind of came up with 6 different reasons. 3 of them are really relevant for the workforce community at large, and then 3 of them are really relevant for the legal profession. And so to start with sort of the general reasons why now, the first reason, and I think you all can appreciate this, is 2020 was a dumpster fire. And by that, I mean, it was just a colossal mess. We had COVID, we had the social justice movement that caused a lot of us to really question our role in society and our obligations to our fellow humans. We had wildfires, we had political unrest. And so 2020 dumpster fire. One of the things that I saw recently was a really interesting Harvard Business Review article that just COVID specific evaluated the impact that COVID had on well-being. The thing that I love about this particular article is that it's neatly packaged into 12 helpful charts because I love pictures. And in this particular study they surveyed 1,500 people across 46 countries. And the results showed that 85% of people who responded reported a general decline in their well-being. And an eye-popping 89% of people reported a decline in their well-being at work. And so for me, my first reaction was anger. That really ticked me off. And then I thought it was also a really somber reminder of how bad things were last year. Now, fast forward 15 months, we have the tremendous gift of science, yay, vaccines. But we're still faced with all of these new challenges as we are trying to navigate post-pandemic life, at least in the United States. People are returning to the office and all of the stress that comes with that, whether it's commutes or childcare challenges, annoying coworkers, mandatory travel, and those are just kind of the tip of the iceberg. The other aspect of this is that people are potentially seeing their coworkers in person for the first time in 15 months. And all of us have been impacted by COVID, and I might even go so far as to say traumatized by COVID in some way. All of us are trying to balance work and home life and social calendars that have just kind of blossomed unexpectedly. And we're also importantly trying to take care of ourselves. The second reason that really applies across the workforce population is that changing workforce demographics are demanding a shift in how we look at work. And this is really driven by the millennials, who up to this point have really had a reputation for being lazy or not being dedicated to their work. And now what we're seeing is that they're really driving this shift in the way that we look at work. They're demanding that employers make work more human and humane, and they're looking for purpose and happiness and a mission in their work. And for them, work is not the be all end all. And so now more than ever, corporate culture is really playing a significant role in employee satisfaction and retention. And that's before we even get Gen Z entering into the workforce as they are starting to do now. So the third and final general reason why we need to be thinking about culture and how we communicate with one another in the workplace differently is what I'm calling, or what I've seen called, #Great Resignation. It's really interesting because I was starting to write a blog on this very topic, and then all of a sudden this week, all over my LinkedIn feed, I'm seeing #The Great Resignation. And that then sort of highlights what's perhaps become a silver lining of COVID, is that all of these ideas about a more human workplace are really catching on across the generational divide. After the last year that everyone has experienced, employees are seeking employers that provide more flexibility and autonomy. And there are even recent reports that show a greater willingness of people to leave their current place of employment, notwithstanding the risks that go along with that, if the culture of that organization does not adapt to meet their needs. So now is the time to be thinking about things differently in the workplace. So if I haven't kind of given you a scary enough picture yet, there are some additional reasons that are really relevant for the legal profession. The first one is burnout. And of course, burnout can apply in any industry, but it is really prevalent in the legal industry. So for those of you who may follow this type of topic on social media, you might be aware that there is a new book out on burnout called Beating Burnout at Work. And it's written by a woman named Paula Davis, who is also a lawyer. And over the last several years, she has studied workplace burnout across industries and within the legal profession. And in her book, she explores a new solution to solving workplace burnout that focuses on building resilience of teams. So in this book, Ms. Davis pulls or draws on the definition of burnout that's developed by the World Health Organization, which is defined as a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. Now, in the book, Ms. Davis talks about 3 dimensions of burnout. The first is feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feelings of negativism or cynicism related to one's job. And then the third dimension is reduced professional efficacy. And so I can't see everybody's pictures or video, but show of hands, anyone ever felt like that? I know I certainly have. The other thing that's really interesting that Ms. Davis cites too in this book is that chronic stress is linked to higher rates of errors, safety issues, things like lack of concentration, lack of focus, and even working memory problems, which dovetails neatly into the second issue that can be really concerning for lawyers, is that can translate into higher rates of malpractice. In the book, Ms. Davis also cites to a study that was done by a malpractice insurance carrier showing the rate of change in malpractice insurance claims that are tied to lawyer-related mistakes. So the initial numbers that are cited are from a 2012 study. And in that earlier study, 15% of total claims had lawyer-related mistakes associated with them. Fast forward 5 years, in 2017, the new number is 63% of malpractice insurance claims for this particular insurance carrier had lawyer-related mistakes to them. So that can be really dire for the legal profession. The last thing that I wanted to call out on this slide before moving forward is that we have this ABA profile on the legal profession, and I'm sure several of you are probably aware of this. And it's dated now, it's 4 years old, I think, at this point. And in that profile, the ABA presents the results of a study they did in partnership with the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation on the state of mental well-being and the state of the legal profession in general. So that particular study involved 13,000 lawyers. And as you see from the statistics on the slide, it showed that mental health issues and problematic drinking are really prevalent within the legal industry. Oh, you know what, Stefan, we just forgot to do the poll question. So I think there is hope in all of this. And so the way forward is by tapping into our feelings. So before I go into the feelings part of it, Stefan, would you mind to draw up the poll question? So I have 4 poll questions for you today. The first 2 are yes or no. The second 2 are multiple choice, and they really talk about having you think about when have you encountered feelings at work, and then how did you respond to those. So I'll give you, 30 seconds to kind of read through the questions, and then Stefan, like if you're seeing a lot of people respond, you can let me know if it's time to close the poll.
Probably give it another 20 seconds or so. I'll go ahead and close the poll.
Great, thank you. There's a lawyer joke that I'm sure a lot of you have heard: never ask a question you don't know the answer to. And so this part I always find really interesting because I never quite know what the responses are going to be. So the first question is, have you ever gotten angry, been sad or scared by something that happened in the workplace? So not surprisingly, it looks like 100% of you who responded said yes. And the reason why I asked that question is because this idea of feelings at work is really prevalent, but people tend not to really think about it. The next question, it looks like we're split evenly on whether you said something, and that is not an uncommon result. I know even in my own practice, in my own life, I debate a lot about, should I say something, should I not say something? And that led then to the next round of questions about why might you say something or not say something in the workplace. And so it looks like the prevalent winner here for why you might say something in the workplace is because you wanted to stick up for yourself. And that is common. I think that's probably one of the most common results that I've seen so far. The most common reason why you wouldn't want to speak up is also what I've seen as the most common reason, which is we don't want to cause conflict, which in some ways is a little bit ironic because as attorneys, adversity and conflict is sort of inherent in the work that we do, and yet we don't want to cause conflict in the workplace. So I think those are really interesting results, and thank you for participating. And Stefan, do we stop sharing to kind of move that on? Close that on my own screen. All right, so thank you very much for humoring me and giving me your thoughts on that. So moving on to why feelings now is that there's some good news and bad news when it comes to feelings. If you're anything like me, I'm sure some of you have probably experienced physical pain at some point in your life. And you probably know that pain is a signal that something is wrong. For example, if you've ever had joint pain, you know it's an indication you might have an orthopedic issue. Or if you put your hand on a hot stove, that pain sensation tells you to remove your hand. I also don't need to tell you, but I will, that it's a really bad idea to ignore the physical signs that your body is sending. And pain is just one example of that. Emotions are no different. Like physical pain, emotions offer valuable insight into what's going on in your mind and your body. And if you look at it from this perspective, we should really be paying more attention to our emotions. Now, if that's not convincing enough, I have some other reasons for you, not the least of which is that there are tons of studies out there that show that mental well-being is as important as physical well-being. Second, mental health has direct correlations to physical health. So for example, if you have depression, studies show that that can be an aggravating risk factor for other types of physical conditions. Third, difficulty with emotional regulation can strain relationships. So that can have real effects with how you get along with coworkers and people in the workplace and relationships in your personal life, friends, family. Also, importantly, the longer you wait to tap into your emotions and even seek mental health care from a mental health professional is that the longer your issue persists. And the longer your issue persists, the more serious it becomes and the more difficult it becomes to treat. And then I think lastly, the thing that resonates with me the most is it prolongs your suffering. This is really relevant for lawyers, if you're anything like me, who have a tendency to suppress their needs, whether they're physical or emotional. And as lawyers, we can have a really strong sense of judgment and a fear of being perceived as weak. But in reality, when you're tapping into your emotions or even seeking care from a mental health professional, it's no different than, say, hiring a personal trainer to help you get into shape, or seeing an oncologist to help you treat your cancer. So now comes the good news. So after all of the scary, here's the good news, is that emotions provide clues, as I said, to what's going on in your mind and your body. And tapping into those emotions helps you know yourself and what you need. So the other thing that's really cool is that emotions play a large role in fighting burnout and building connection in the workplace. And so drawing back to the Burnout book from Ms. Davis, she talks about burnout being caused by an imbalance between the demands of one's job and what are called job resources, which are those aspects of your work that give you motivation, give you energy, and stimulate personal growth and learning and development. So as it turns out, high quality relationships and social support are job resources. And so in that way, it becomes key to both physical and emotional health to build quality relationships at work. So let me be clear that when I say tapping your emotions at work is not the same as therapy. So from my layperson's perspective, therapy helps you understand how past events influence how or why you might act or feel a certain way in a certain situation. And that knowledge is really important. But when I say tapping your emotions, I mean increasing your awareness about what's happening in the here and now. And that increased awareness, as we'll talk about a little bit later, helps you communicate more intentionally and more effectively about what you need rather than simply reacting in the moment. Now, as I see it, there are two main benefits to communicating more intentionally about your needs, although these are not the only two benefits. First is that it allows others to know you better, and it provides a roadmap for how they can engage with you more effectively. It gives you an opportunity to be fully heard. And when the other person acknowledges the guidance that you've given them, and ideally maybe even changes their behavior, it validates your need. And through that validation, your level of trust grows and your connection to that colleague grows. Secondly, when you communicate your needs, it serves as an invitation to reciprocate. And it shows that other person that you are open to receiving guidance from them. Much like a game of tennis where you have a serve and return, the cycle of communication becomes self-perpetuating. And it becomes a cycle of sharing, learning, trust, and connection, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And that connection is what builds resilience, it reduces burnout, and it helps teams navigate change. So now that I've set the background, I want to talk a little bit about emotions themselves. And I'm sure many of you have heard the lawyer joke: if you ask the same question to 5 different lawyers, you'll get 5 different answers. And it kind of works the same way with emotions. So if you ask different therapists or clinical professionals how many emotions there are, you get all kinds of answers. Some may tell you that there are 6 basic emotions. Others may tell you there are up to 34,000 emotions. And that's where something like an emotion wheel can be really valuable. Now, there are different iterations of emotion wheels. They all have their pros and cons. This one is from the Junto Institute. If you're really intrigued by this graphic, there is a link to an article from Shape Magazine and the resources slide that talks about the different types of emotion wheels and how they're used. So on this particular emotion wheel, you see 6 core emotions: joy, love, fear, anger, sadness, and surprise. And all of the emotion wheels are kind of structured in the same way, in that you have sort of a core central group, and then other emotions are grouped sort of on the exterior or perimeter, but they're all sort of grouped relative to one of the 6 core emotions. Some of the other emotion wheels are cool in that they also might show sort of the connection point where 2 emotions kind of are blended together to create a third emotion. Emotion wheels are often used in therapy, and there are similar tools that are out there I've even seen for parents to use for their children. So like one of the examples I saw recently was cards with different like facial structures on them, and the parents have the child point to whichever facial structure they're feeling, because that helps the child articulate what emotion they're feeling. And emotion wheels work pretty much the same way, and they're cool in my opinion in that it provides some context, gives people something to look at, particularly when they're feeling jumbled and having difficulty articulating a specific feeling. And the thing that becomes powerful is that there's value in being able to identify a feeling, because once you have identified it, you can then start to manage it, and you're better equipped to react to it in a more reasonable manner. Being able to label your emotions can also bring a sense of peace, because you may be feeling, oh, I'm feeling off, but I don't know why. And then once you are able to label it, yes, I know what's going on. The other thing that's really interesting is that there are studies out there that show that the better people regulate their emotions, the happier they are and the more financially successful they are. So for those of you who might be motivated by money, obviously there's a pro here for being able to regulate your emotions. So this also kind of ties into the concept of awareness, which again, we'll discuss in a little bit. But what I have actually even seen is that some therapists take this concept of an emotional wheel and they distill it down to what I call 4 primary emotions: happy, sad, scared, and angry. And that's kind of the premise that I'm working off of for today. So on the slide, you see the 4 primary emotions, as I call them, and they're oriented on the slide not to give more prominence to anger, but to show their relation to vulnerability. So on the top level, happy, sad, and scared all require a degree of vulnerability, whereas anger requires little to no expression of vulnerability. So one of the things, if you're like me, that I have struggled with is I have for a really long time classified emotions as either good or bad. There's no right or wrong answer with that, and there's no judgment if you have, and it's something, as I said, I still struggle with. But as we kind of start to dip our toe in this idea of feelings at work, one of the things that I encourage you to be open about is that is the idea that there's no such thing as a bad feeling. Yes, some feelings are more pleasurable than others. I would much rather be happy than sad or angry. But each of these feelings has a purpose and it tells us something about ourselves. And so I, again, would encourage you to take the perspective that there's no such thing as a bad feeling. The other thing about feelings that's really interesting is that there's a correlation between feeling and a need. As I mentioned on one of the prior slides, emotions give you clues to what's happening in your mind. For example, when you're happy, a need is being met. When you're sad or scared or angry, that's your indication that you have some sort of unmet need. So with each emotion, each has a purpose, and there are upsides and maybe surprisingly downsides to each of the emotions. So first, happiness. As I said, this is an indicator that a need has been met. You feel safe, you feel secure, you feel comfortable, you've achieved the goal. And obviously the positives of happiness is that there is a correlation between happiness and positive thinking, positive attitudes, positive behaviors. But interestingly, happiness also requires the most vulnerability. And for those of you who follow Brene Brown, you've probably heard her talk about this, because in this moment of happiness, there's also this fear of fragility, that your happiness is fleeting, that it will be taken away, and that you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. The second emotion, sadness, is an indicator of an unmet need. And as you probably are well aware, it plays a large role in grieving and in loss. And even in the workplace, you can experience sadness when a particular situation did not go the way you had hoped. You had hoped for promotion, you had hoped for a successful verdict for your client, and you can experience sadness in those ways. Just as sadness is valuable because it can help you reflect on your loss or what you had hoped for a particular situation, there are also some clinical benefits to sadness, such as improvements in memory, greater precision in reading social cues, increasing your motivation. And this one I thought was really surprising, but that it can improve certain types of uncertain and unpredictable interpersonal interactions. Because when you're in a state of sadness, you're also more contemplative and you're more aware of what's going on around you. The third emotion, fear or being scared, has a very big purpose in the evolution of humans. And that dates back to the fight, flight, or freeze response that we saw in cavemen. If there's a lion and you run, you have a better chance of surviving as if you stay still. So like sadness, fear is an indication of an unmet need, such as the need to feel safe or the need to have certainty. Like sadness, fear can also have benefits, not the least of which is that protective aspect, but it can also result in heightened awareness. It can get your adrenaline pumping, which can give you energy. And when you are able to channel that energy effectively, you can do really cool things when you're sort of in this fear mode. You hear stories of people like lifting cars off of someone who's pinned beneath it. So the fourth primary emotion is anger. As I said earlier, anger requires the least vulnerability. And anger is really interesting because it has actually a dual purpose. So the first purpose is more of a positive purpose, where anger can be a constructive emotion that drives you to engage in goal-oriented activities like speaking up for oneself or another, which is what we clearly saw on the poll results. And particularly, anger drives us when we feel like something is unjust or unfair. The flip side of anger is that it has an uncanny ability to obscure the bigger picture. And so in this way, when you or someone in your life is experiencing anger, it's really important to closely study where that anger is coming from. Anger can often present as the first reaction in a situation, and sometimes it takes a little digging to get at what's underneath. And usually it's either sadness or fear, but it comes out as anger because it's protective, and anger is the least vulnerable emotion to show. The other thing to note is that oftentimes emotions can manifest as physical symptoms in the body. And so this is where I'll cue you to pull in the handout from today's session. You'll see that there are 3 exercises on this particular handout, but I'd like us to just focus for a minute or so on the first one, which is where I'd like to encourage you to jot down some notes on how emotions show up for you in your body. So to give you some examples, for me, when I am really angry, my back hurts. And so when I was practicing, the way that I saw that manifesting is if I would get off the phone with opposing counsel and my back was hurting, that was my cue that I was really ticked off and I was really stressed out. And so, I was able to sort of self-care, take a couple of deep breaths and kind of decompress from that really stressful meeting. For me, sadness, when I'm really, really upset, I shake. And so I know when I'm in a very emotional situation and I'm shaking, that I'm sad. So I'll give you 30 to 45 seconds, a minute maybe, to jot down a few thoughts to get your juices flowing about how emotions might show up for you. So maybe give you another 10 seconds or so to wrap up your thoughts. Okay. So before I leave this slide and transition to the part of the program where we start to apply all of this information to our legal practices, I wanted to leave you with 2 final thoughts for this slide. First, it's possible to experience more than one feeling at once. Have you ever heard the expression tears of joy, right? So you're happy, but there's also some sort of underlying emotion that may be driving your tears. Second, and this is something that's been a really powerful lesson for me, is that feelings can, but they don't have to transfer from person to person. So, to take one example, have you ever been in a meeting where, you're jazzed, you're happy, you're excited, and those emotions kind of get transferred to other people in the room? The flip side can happen with other emotions like anger. And I think the thing that's really powerful and important to remember is that you get to have your feelings, I get to have my feelings about a certain situation, and you don't have to pick up my feelings, I don't have to pick up your feelings, but we can, and there's a choice involved in that. So I guess I would encourage you to remain aware of the power that you have to be able to sort of navigate your own emotions relative to those of others. Okay, So now let's talk about how we take all of this information and apply it to our legal practice. But before we dive into that, I wanted to take a moment for you to reflect on the fact that you engage with a ton of people that I call stakeholders in connection with your work. And the reason why that becomes important, as you'll see in a couple of slides, is that your response in a given situation may be tied in large part to the type of stakeholders that are involved. Now, this slide, as I was kind of just thinking through my own practice, lists what I viewed as the most common stakeholders that you might encounter. And I would encourage you to reflect on if there are other stakeholders that you engage with regularly as part of your work. So for me, in my practice, it was clients, business partners, compliance, my leadership, my coworkers and other peers in the legal department and the support staff that I worked with, my opposing counsel as a regulatory attorney, the regulators that I was working with, if you're a litigator, certainly the judge. And of course, if you're a litigator, also the jury are stakeholders in this process. The other thing that I would note is that this slide, intentionally so, is limited to the people in your work sphere. It doesn't take into consideration your non-work stakeholders like family and friends, whose relationships might also benefit from applying some of today's lessons. Okay, so let's get into the meat of the issue. Now that we know why feelings are important, let's talk about applying it in your practice. And if you're anything like me, I'm very logical and rational and analytic. And this idea of talking about your feelings seems very messy and very hard and overwhelming to do. And so as a process-oriented person, I thought it might be helpful to articulate all of this in steps. And the first step that I see is raising awareness. And the reason why I have awareness first is that it is a really powerful tool in interrupting the neural pathways that exist in your body. Now, I am not a neuroscientist or a clinician, and I'm sure some of you on this phone call can probably school me in what I'm about to share, but I'd like to try and take a stab at talking about how information is passed through our body. And if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a picture of a neuron. That's the thing that's in orange, and there are two other neurons that are in gray. Neurons are comprised of several parts, and the way that your body communicates or transmits information, or the nervous system, I should say, transmits information from one part of your body to another is by sending signals from neuron to neuron. Neurons, as I said, have several parts. The dendrites, which you see kind of sticking out on the sides, are the part of the neuron that receives the signal from other neurons. And the axon, the piece that kind of comes down from the bottom, is the part of the neuron that sends the signal to other neurons. Now, if you look at the tip of the axon, you'll see that it splits in two. And in order for, and the signal can go either of those two directions. And I just totally lost my train of thought. And so the way that the neuron works is that over time, and the direction that the signal goes, there we go, is based on the strength of the signal and how often that signal is transmitted through the neuron. And so over time, what happens, if the signal keeps going down the same path, the fatty acid, or what's known as the myelin sheath that surrounds that transmission pathway, gets thicker, and it continues to promote the signal going in that direction. And that's what the neural pathway is. But if you exercise awareness, that neural pathway is interrupted. So in the most simplistic form, this awareness gives you more control and the ability to choose how you respond. So it's not necessarily a do what you feel, but it's a feel what you feel and then choose how you respond. And then obviously the more times you choose the alternate route, the myelin sheath on that route gets stronger and thicker, and it creates a new neural pathway. So the way this plays out in real life is to label your feeling as a way to self-regulate it. And while it's certainly best to observe that feeling in the moment, it's absolutely okay to regroup and identify it after the fact. And in fact, it's not uncommon to feel one emotion in the moment, often anger, as we've talked about, because that tends to manifest first, and then discover after the fact that other emotions were also involved. Once you have sort of identified your emotion and labeled it, the last part of this is that it's really key to validate that emotion and to tell yourself that it's okay to feel that way. As lawyers, we have a tendency to judge ourselves really harshly. I know I do. And because each emotion has a purpose, it's okay to experience that emotion, even if it's unpleasurable. So the last piece as a reminder again is that you can experience multiple emotions at the same time. So the next step, for some reason the picture is not popping up. It's a picture of the thinking man sculpture. But the next step after you've raised your awareness and labeled your emotions is to do an assessment. And the assessment should take several factors into consideration, including which stakeholders are involved, the needs of you and your stakeholder, the costs and benefits of communicating those needs, and then lastly, developing a plan. So from my perspective, it's really important to identify the stakeholders first because that informs much of the remainder of your analysis. Just as you have relationships with lots of different people, your relationships with all of these people will be different. So for example, you might be more willing to share more vulnerably with a coworker than you would with your leadership. And you may be even less willing to share something with a client or a judge, for example. So to help you think through some of the questions you might want to ask yourself during the assessment phase, the handout includes 2 different types of reflection exercises that we don't have time for here today live. But you'll see one is a reflection exercise around a difficult interaction, and the other is a reflection around a positive interaction. And you'll see as you kind of go through the exercises that each exercise, as you kind of get to the end, has you planning out how you might want to communicate about your feelings to your chosen stakeholder and apply those observations more broadly in your work. As you're developing your plan, it's important to keep in mind that you decide what you share and when and how much. And I think that's really important because again, we have sort of this initial reaction of feelings are messy, and you don't have to tell your coworker that you get triggered by judgment because of something that happened in your childhood, but you can tell them that you felt judged and you did not like that. The other thing that I wanted to do and take a moment to acknowledge is that I know that even the mere idea of these kinds of conversations can cause discomfort. And so that's why I think it's really important to evaluate the costs and benefits and to remind you that there can be real consequences for not speaking up. So first and foremost, if you are wanting something different, if you have a different need, you want someone's behavior to change, if you don't speak up and say something about it, then the likelihood of those behaviors changing or that need being met is low. Secondly, is if those behaviors don't change, your need continues to go unmet, that disappointment and hurt can get acted out in other ways, usually via passive aggressive behavior, or if you're like me, you just like blow up one day over the smallest thing. And thirdly, I think one of the other consequences, and perhaps the most important consequence, is that if you don't speak up, there's no ability to repair the relationship. And so you can continue to have this fractured relationship with your stakeholder. All right, so now we are at the communication phase where the rubber really hits the road. And this is where you engage in a conversation with your stakeholder about your needs. You know, as I was thinking about my own legal practice, I saw several areas where these types of conversations could be useful, whether it's managing some sort of conflict or having a conversation, about your workload, other types of relationship management conversations, and even interacting with and listening to your clients. So this communication phase has a couple of different components to it. And the first one is what I call gentle startup. And this is a terminology that's rooted in therapy practices. It's used often in group therapy or in couples therapy. And what I mean when I say gentle startup is starting with some sort of statement of intent, such as a desire to grow or to connect, to repair a relationship, build trust, work together more effectively, etc. And I will also say that as I kind of wrap up the slide, I'll give an example to pull all of this together and give some context. The other thing that's really important to do at this particular stage, if you are able to, is to identify any points of agreement that you have, because those can be grounding as you start to sort of really engage in and the conversation unfolds. The next component is to set boundaries. And I encourage you to really just stick with the facts and describe what happened, as opposed to getting into personal attacks, because then that makes the other person defensive and really serves to be unproductive in the conversation. The other thing that's really important to do at this phase, to the extent that you can, is assume positive intent, and even go so far as to acknowledge that the person that you're talking with probably did not mean for their behavior to land in that particular way. They probably didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Hopefully you get the drift. If you feel comfortable, you might even want to make a tentative guess at what they might have been feeling or experiencing in the moment. And then the third thing to do as part of the setting boundaries is to describe the impact and articulate the feeling. Is that made me feel unheard. That made me feel frustrated, and I didn't appreciate that. Next is make your big ask. And this is where you share your need or describe the behavior you would want to see instead. The fourth component to this is to listen. And I'll take a moment to just sort of acknowledge that it's not uncommon to get anxious when we're giving and receiving this type of feedback. So it's really important to stop, take a breath, slow things down, and if you can, even try and have awareness in the moment for how you're feeling, and even call it out, for example. So, for example, I was in doing another presentation, and someone asked a question that totally stumped me, and I was like, I'm feeling anxious right now because I don't know how to respond to this question. So being able to take a minute and pause kind of helps you get your bearings. The other thing that's really important, and you'll see this as a trend, is to really listen to your stakeholders' response and engage your active listening skills by repeating what you think you heard. It's also really important to stay curious and ask for clarification on anything that may be unclear. At the conclusion, again, to the extent that you feel comfortable doing this, it's really helpful to express appreciation for the opportunity to share your feedback and the stakeholders' willingness to listen. The thing that's interesting is that in some instances, you may find that your stakeholder was experiencing something similar, and being able to find that common ground, whether it's a shared emotion or a shared goal, is really important. Because emotions can manifest in different ways, that sometimes can be distracting or confusing from the underlying issue if it's not clearly articulated. And so being able to stay true to that thing that's shared, much like the gentle startup, kind of helps you stay grounded in this conversation. Now, the other thing that I've come to notice is that as lawyers and working in corporate America, there is this great emphasis on concise communication. The problem that I see with that is that we often leave out really valuable context. There's a lot going on inside our head that often goes unsaid. And the way to remedy that is to share all of that information. I call it sharing your narrative. And the more words you use, the more helpful it is. So to kind of wrap a bow on all of this and tie it up in a neat package, let me give you the example of a situation where you're in a meeting with a coworker and they kept interrupting you and it made you mad. And so the way you might be able to approach this conversation is to, reach out to them, let them know that you'd like to talk with them about something. And then when you start the meeting, say that you've been thinking about this, it's something that you'd like to share to be able to improve your working relationship and have them help to get you to know you better. And you can also say that you don't want to make them defensive, and that you are, for example, if they were interrupting you because you were brainstorming, you can identify the point of agreement as we're both enthusiastic about working on this problem, and we share the goal of wanting to be able to help the client. When you move into the setting the boundaries phase, you can talk about, so we were in this meeting earlier today, and I noticed that as I was kind of, throwing out ideas, you kept interrupting me. And I'm sure that it was because you were really excited and you didn't mean anything by it, but I was frustrated by that because I felt like I wasn't having an opportunity for my perspective to be heard. And then when you make your ask, you say, going forward, I would appreciate it if you would be mindful of that. And when we are, conversing together or working together in meetings, let me have an opportunity to, state my piece before you react and respond to it. And then of course, you give them an opportunity to weigh in, to respond, perhaps even apologize, and then kind of the conversation unfolds from there. So this last step is really for the person who's on the receiving end of the feedback. So if you've gotten to this point in the presentation and you're still unsure about it, how you want to do this, use this information in your practice, I'd encourage you to listen up, because you may still be on the receiving end of one of these conversations, and some of these tips might help you be able to react and respond in the moment. So if you look at the picture, you'll see that awareness plays a big role here too. It falls in the center as a reminder that you should be scanning what emotions you're feeling, and perhaps even observe what's going on with your stakeholder. The first thing then it's important to do after sort of just being aware is to identify your role. As lawyers, we are good problem solvers, and we have a tendency to jump directly into problem solving mode. And sometimes we're just being asked to listen. And so if you're not clear on what your role is, it's really helpful to just clarify. The second thing, and you see this as a trend, is to listen and really, really listen. We've seen throughout the presentation that emotions can mask one another, so sometimes you have to dig to get at what's really underneath. Third, it's important to validate and acknowledge the role that you played, assuming that you agree. So it could take the example of, I see why that may have been frustrating, and I did not intend for it to be frustrating for you, or I did not intend to make you feel bad, or you get the picture. The thing that tends to happen is that we get into defensive mode and we want to offer our explanation. And it's okay to do that, because again, you have your perspective and I have mine, but it's important to do that validation first before offering your perspective, because it shows the other person that you hear them. The next thing is that it's really important to be curious about your partner. Again, slow it down. I'm sure that many of you have been in situations where the client asks you one question, but after a little prodding, you realize they're asking you something completely different. And the same thing applies here. So it's really important to get curious and ask clarifying issues or questions to get to the heart of the matter. The next step that you want to be able to do is relate if you can. So pulling forward the example of the coworker who was interrupting you. If you've been in a similar situation where you were continually interrupted, you can express that, relate that you understand that you also felt frustrated by that example. If you cannot relate or have not been in a similar situation, you can still relate to the emotion that they're feeling: anger, sadness, fear, and you can be able to verbalize that. I understand what you're feeling. The last step is to repair, and by that I mean apologize if you think it's necessary. We often have a tendency to say sorry very casually, and so I would encourage you to think about using sorry as a way to repair for when you've hurt someone's feelings or you've done something wrong. The other important part of repair is to commit to changing your behavior if necessary, and then of course actually doing that going forward, because actions often speak louder than words. So we're pretty much at the end of our presentation. I'll try and do some wrap up so we have time for some questions. So just a couple of takeaways is as we wrap up, I'd offer these final few reminders about integrating your feelings into your workplace interactions. First, of course, is to stay aware. Look for those physical cues your body might be sending you, and then label those emotions. Second is to stay curious, whether you're the one giving or receiving feedback. Third, share that narrative. Again, the more words, the better. And then the last thing I would really encourage you to do is keep practicing. These conversations can be really difficult, but they are so worthwhile. And it's really rewarding when you are part of a conversation like this, when it repairs or strengthens a relationship. I also encourage you to approach the conversation with a sense of grace for yourself and for your stakeholder, and understand that you're both doing the best you can to work through it. Allow yourself room for stumbles and missteps, because it absolutely will happen. And the important thing to remember is those stumbles and missteps are how you learn and grow. So the last slide I have is just sort of a recap of the resources. You've seen sort of the first handout that has you brainstorming about how emotions show up in your body, and those reflection exercises about how you might sort of think through and develop your plan for communicating with your coworkers or other stakeholders. The second, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide, is what I'm calling a mindfulness calendar. It's editable, so you can fill it out for each month. And it has prompts for you to notate what emotions you're feeling throughout the course of your day. At the end of each week or at the end of each month, I'd encourage you to reflect on how your emotions change over the course of a week or month, and then maybe look for trends even. So for example, if you're regularly ticked off or angry at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, you might want to look at what's happening at 9:30. And perhaps that's a meeting with your boss, like your weekly one-on-one. And so maybe that's time for a conversation with your boss. Or if you start your day happy and by the end of every day you are feeling ick, that might be a cue for you to evaluate what's going on at work and if there's anything that you can do to change that. So I'd love feedback on these resources, if they're helpful, if one was more helpful than the other. If you make any adjustments to make them more useful for your own practice, I would love to hear about that. And then the other resources that I have here for you are just some of the articles that I thought were interesting, including the ABA profile on the legal profession and some of the articles around the wheel of emotions and anger. And I would note that if I was talking about an article or a study that you don't see reflected here, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to share it with you. So lastly, I've really enjoyed being here with you today, and I would love to chat if you have any questions. These are a couple of the ways that you can get a hold of me by email or through my website or on LinkedIn. If you also have any success stories that you can share based on applying some of your learning from today, I'd love to hear those. So that kind of wraps it up for me. And I think we'll open it up for questions now.
If you'd like to come off mute, you should be able to do so. All right, well, not seeing any questions, Jen, but thank you so much for your presentation. This has been amazing. Thank you so much for being a part of Health Law Week.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
All right. Thank you so much, and everybody have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.